Hey guys, I am so excited to share with you the story of these two side tables I picked up from Facebook Marketplace. I watched the price get knocked down to $160, but it was still too high, so I tried something that's worked for me, flattery. And it worked. I got them for $100 and brought them home to work on them. Now look at these absolute beauties. I love a good set of matching side tables, and this one is glorious. I love the lines. It's by White Fine Furniture. It's very well made, albeit in a little bit of poor shape right now. The finish is failing. I'm not too worried about that, but this was an area of concern. It was missing veneer. What I didn't realize was that whole chunk was missing. Not sure how I missed that. Also, the inside cabinets have some sticky goo on it I was not able to remove with Goo Gone. I would have to address that later. The hardware is lovely. In addition to this item on the leg, now the bottom didn't have it, but I'm pretty sure this is brass and I think it's going to clean up beautifully. As usual, I removed all that glorious hardware that I will reuse so that I could properly clean the piece. I used hot soapy water, it was Dawn dish detergent, and scrubbed down the piece thoroughly. This is a good time to look for any damage you're not aware of, and also to make sure there's no pesky bugs or woodworm. And that's why I literally clean every surface. And when I'm done, I always rinse it with clean fresh water to remove any of that soapy residue. What I'm going to do is make a model of this piece right here because it is what this should look like here. So I'm going to use some hot glue to create that mold. Now the first thing I'm going to do is apply some Vaseline to this area that I'm making the mold from, so that when I go to remove the hot glue mold, it will release easier. Now you can use any glue stick. Those little tiny ones will work, but it'll be incredibly labor intensive. So I would suggest the big chunky glue sticks. And I'm using this tongue depressor to catch the glue because I need a good coating on the underside of that lip as well. I'm going to be eventually filling this mold with Bondo, so I need an entire area to encase that Bondo mixture. Now when it dried, I proceeded to try to pry it off. I did struggle a little bit. Kevin was watching me and I could tell he was getting nervous. He probably thought I was getting upset, but I wasn't.
I suddenly don't want to be here.
Look at that. I inserted a few small nails into the piece and deliberately banged them off to the side because this is a pretty vulnerable spot. That corner is an area that most people will hold on to as they lift it up. So those nails are there to help secure the Bondo in place. I put Vaseline on the inside of the mold to release the Bondo easily. I mixed up some Bondo and quickly filled that mold. Now I'm pushing it because I'm hoping I'm not trapping any air bubbles inside, which ultimately I did, and I'll address that later. But I scooped out whatever oozed out and then I left it alone to set. And while that was drying, I used a TSP alternative to clean off all of that Vaseline residue that I had put all over the corner of that piece. You don't want any kind of oil, dirt, or grime on your piece because it can interfere with your primer and paint adhering. Now that looks like a hot mess, but it's going to turn out beautiful, I promise. I pulled out some 150 grit sandpaper and got to sanding with my Surfprep. Now you can use any sander you want. This is just one that I have. And while that sandpaper I took off looked okay, I've learned to change my sandpaper frequently to avoid any of those pigtail swirls. I turned on my DeWalt shop vac to suck in any dust, and I started to sand the piece. Now here I'm going very slowly. I'm not applying any pressure, again, to avoid those pigtail swirls. But I am not sanding down to bare wood. I'm simply sanding to remove any of that finish that's failing. I need to create a smooth surface for the paint. And you'll see that I'm changing direction of the way I'm sanding because the wood grain on this piece changes that same direction. You need to sand with the wood grain. I ended up scuff sanding the entire piece. And when you scuff sand, you're not sanding to bare wood, you're simply creating micro scratches for your primer and or paint to adhere to. And this I want to show you. I did have to sand down to bare wood, and I've now exposed that wood grain, and I'm going to have to address that later. Now I started to sand the Bondo smooth, and I remembered, I could use a straight razor to smooth out or at least alleviate some of the excess Bondo so that I wouldn't have to sand so much to make it smooth. And then I kept sanding. It was labor intensive, but guys, it's just incredible how this thing turned out. I used some of that used sandpaper that still had life in it to hand sand the beveled area back. So this is where I am right now. I've worked that little beveled edge. I'm still trying to smooth that out. I don't want to work too hard because I'm afraid it's going to start to lift. This beveled edge, I'll probably have to work on with a Dremel. Same thing here and there. Now this is where that bubble of Bondo was missing. And so I'm just going to work with this. And I'm going to keep working on the shape with the sandpaper and with the Dremel. Partly off camera because this is going to take a little while. Look at that. You can still see that tiny little divot where there was that air bubble within the Bondo. But some of that's going to fill in with primer and paint, but also it just adds to the age of the piece. Now the next thing I wanted to do was to remove those brass findings off the feet. Is that what you call it? Brass finding? So that I could properly clean them, but also paint without them present. Some of them were a little tough to remove, others were very easy. I put that blue painter's tape there to try to prevent me from scratching those brass findings with my screwdriver. I'm saving those nails because they too are brass and I'll need to polish them and reuse them when I put those pieces back on the legs. Wow. That is outstanding. I did scratch it a little bit, but I can buff that out or put it on the inside when it's replaced. I finished up my scuff sanding, and as you can see here, for some reason the sides were really badly dented. I did try to smooth out as much as I can, knowing once again I was exposing that wood grain and I would have to address that later. When you paint on top of a surface like this that has some wood grain exposed, you will see that different texture through the paint. I have finally finished sanding these pieces inside and out, and I found a couple of areas that needed to be filled with a little bit of
wood putty, so I did that. But I want to show you, look at all of the sand pads I went through. I don't even think this is all of them. But what concerns me is that my sand pads were gunking up real quickly with this stuff. I don't know what it is, except that perhaps there was some oil or furniture polish still on them that I didn't clean properly, especially in those little creases when I was sanding them. It was a weird texture. So what I'm going to do is clean these off really well. These pieces need to be super, super cleaned well again before I prime tomorrow.
I headed outside that following weekend and sprayed everything down with shellac. By spraying it with shellac, I was hoping to create a uniform surface for the paint to sit down on. And even before I headed inside, I could see what I was talking about? You can see that different texture where I sanded down to wood grain. However, I'm using a new paint that has a built-in primer, and I was curious to see if it would fill in that wood grain, so we'll see. Now, it said not to thin the paint, so against my better judgment, I didn't. I just filtered it into the canister. And what I did before spraying was I quickly sanded and lightly dusted off any debris that may have landed in that shellac. Now, I didn't film the spraying that I started here because it was a hot mess, but as you can see, I had problems. The paint was having a hard time coming out of the sprayer. So I headed inside and I did add about 15% water, and now it's spraying so much easier. Now, one thing I want to point out is if you look, you can see an orange peel texture. Too much paint was coming out of my sprayer, and it was leaving that orange texture, which I'd have to address later by sanding it before I put on that second coat of paint.
Okay, I'm already seeing some things that are going to need to be fixed before my second coat of paint. Right here, where you see that different texture, is where I sanded down to bare wood. And I showed that to you, I think it was on this side. And it's still wet, so I don't know if we're going to see it there, but that is going to have to be filled. I'll water down some wood putty and I'll put it on there and kind of squeegee it this way to fill in the grain, sand it, spot, shellac those areas, and then I'll be able to paint a second coat of blue.
You can see the wood grain now that's been filled with wood putty, and that's exactly what I wanted. With all of that dusted off, I did spray the piece with shellac. Now the shellac again is going to create, hopefully, a uniform surface for that paint to go down on, so you won't see a different texture where wood filler remains. It looks like the wood filler is still there, but it is sanded smooth and it just stayed where I had exposed that wood grain. And the intention is to eliminate that texture showing through the paint. Now, there's less orange peel there, so I'm hoping that as it dries, it self-levels.
It's Thursday afternoon. I just got home, and y'all, I think it looks good. It looked like there was still going to be a lot of texture on the top, indicating the wood grain that I had exposed. And there is some, but y'all, it's good. I feel so much better. So I'm going to put one more coat on the top just to be sure it's got good coverage. And then I do still need to clean the hardware, and then I'm done. I need to figure out what to do on the inside though. Am I gonna use a gel stain? Am I gonna use Restore Finish? I need to figure out what to do to even out the color in there because of all the gunk that was in there and the sanding I had to do to remove it. That I need to figure out too, but I'm on the home stretch.
The steel wool and the Brasso cleaned up these brass beautifully, and I did the same process to clean the dresser knobs and those beautiful drop holes.
Look how pretty.
You see how shiny those nails are? Yep, I cleaned those with the Brasso as well. I'm using this gel stain for the first time. Gel stain sits on top of the surface. It doesn't get absorbed like a typical oil-based furniture stain. I do feel it did blend in the colors much better than it had been, and so that's how I kind of evened out the color inside those cabinets. Now let's look back and see what these pieces looked like before and now.